Usually when we look at a utopian community or um, a group of people just pulling up stakes to build their own isolated world from scratch, there is this very specific, almost suffocating expectation of strictness.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like an architect's rigid blueprint.
Exactly. You always picture this charismatic leader at the top, right?
Yeah.
And they hand down this massive, exhaustive list of rules.
Right, like what you're allowed to eat or, who you are permitted to marry.
Exactly. What time you have to be out in the fields, what color clothing you can wear. And the followers, well, by and large, they just get in line and surrender their autonomy.
It really just boils down to a fundamental desire for control. I mean, the underlying philosophy of almost every historical commune or utopian experiment is that human beings are inherently flawed.
Right.
And so the only way to create a perfect society is by engineering every single human behavior from the top down. You eliminate the variables, you eliminate individual choice entirely.
Which is wild to think about.
It is, but in a strange psychological way, people often flock to those movements precisely because they want that heavy, terrifying burden of making choices taken away from them.
Right. They just want someone to tell them what to do. But then you step into the world of a place called San Aurelio.
Yeah. San Aurelio is a completely different animal.
It really is. So for you listening, today we are looking at an incredibly short-lived, deeply controversial community that existed out in the dense, unforgiving swamps of the Florida Everglades. And with San Aurelio, that traditional blueprint of control isn't just, thrown out the window. It is actively viewed as a manifestation of pure evil.
Which is such a massive paradigm shift.
It totally is. We are looking at a settlement that operated on a single radical premise, which is that the absolute highest moral law, the entire foundation of human existence, was the total, uncompromising absence of top-down control.
Right. No rules from above.
Exactly. And taking that premise to its absolute limit ended with the federal government surrounding them and the entire settlement burning to the ground.
It is the absolute definition of a philosophical high-wire act. And, I mean, the fall from that wire was just catastrophic.
So catastrophic.
The source material we have for this deep dive is a document simply titled sanaurelio.pdf.
Which is such a mundane title for something so wild.
Right, but it's this exhaustive, deeply investigative account that managed to pull together internal diaries, federal court transcripts, and the personal theological writings of the community's founders.
So our mission today is to decode the foundational software of San Aurelio. We aren't just looking at the physical history, the salvaged buildings, the goats, the silver coins, or the tactical raid that brought it all down.
Right, the surface level stuff.
Yeah, we are going deeper. We are going to examine an incredibly unique radical theology engineered by two men, Daniel and Gabo. They basically took devout scriptural Christianity and fused it on a molecular level with the hardcore, decentralized, free market principles of Austrian economics.
Which is not a combination you hear every day. But before we plunge into how they actually managed to merge those two seemingly disparate worlds, we really need to establish the ground rules for the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
Because the theology we are unpacking today inherently touches on incredibly sensitive, politically charged themes. I mean, we are going to be diving deep into the inherent nature of the government, the morality of taxation, the limits of state power, and radical, unfiltered individualism.
Right.
So I want to be absolutely clear here. Our goal is not to endorse or condemn these views, whether they align with left-wing or right-wing political ideologies. We are simply acting as impartial guides, just unpacking the fascinating ideas contained in the historical record. Our focus is purely on the architecture of their thought process.
Right. It's about understanding the internal logic of a worldview that most people can't even fathom. And to understand that logic, we really have to start with the architects themselves.
You really do.
Because you cannot grasp how this theology was built without understanding the profoundly different, deeply specific traumas that Daniel and Gabo brought with them.
Exactly.
They eventually crossed paths in a modest beige stucco church in Hialeah, Florida. But the roads they took to get to those pews could not have been more different. So let's start with Daniel Herrera.
Yeah, Daniel's background really defies the usual origin story of a radical separatist.
Oh, completely.
He wasn't some marginalized outcast railing against a system that rejected him. Not at all. He was born into immense comfort in Tampa, Florida. He was the heir apparent to a highly lucrative family business, Herrera Construction.
Like serious money.
Very serious money.
Yeah.
We were talking about a company that built municipal roads, public schools, and these sprawling city housing projects. They were the absolute picture of well-dressed, well-connected country club success, and they were also incredibly generous financial pillars of their local church.
Right, they were the ultimate insiders, the kind of people who have the mayor's personal phone number on speed dial.
Precisely. But the source text pinpoints a specific, horrifying turning point in Daniel's life.
Yeah, this part is just brutal.
It is. About 15 years before San Aurelio was even a concept, a massive city housing project on the east side of Tampa, which was built almost entirely by Herrera Construction, suffered a catastrophic structural collapse.
And this wasn't an old building, right?
No, not at all. This building hadn't even been open to residents for a full year. First, the walls began to show these deep structural cracks. Then the roofs began leaking unstoppably, and eventually an entire concrete stairwell completely gave way during the middle of the day.
Oh my God.
Yeah, multiple residents were severely injured in the rubble. One person, a young father, was permanently paralyzed.
Now, a tragedy like that is terrible on its own, obviously, but the mechanical failure of a building isn't what shatters Daniel's worldview here.
No, it's the aftermath.
Right. What fractures his reality is the realization of why the building failed and the machinery of power that activated to protect his family afterward.
The fallout is exactly where Daniel's trauma of complicity is born. Because what happens next is just a masterclass in municipal corruption.
Yeah.
The city government quietly orchestrates a cover-up. A financial settlement is paid out to the victims in hushed tones, complete with these ironclad non-disclosure agreements.
Of course.
And Herrera Construction. They don't lose their licenses. They keep receiving lucrative, taxpayer-funded city contracts. The official line peddled by the city bureaucrats and the safety inspectors was that the collapse was an unforeseen anomaly. They literally classified it as an act of God.
Which is an incredible phrase to use, considering Daniel had physically been to that construction site with his father during the build.
He had, and he saw the reality behind the quote-unquote act of God. He saw the cheap, substandard rebar being substituted for the industrial steel they had actually built the city for.
Wow, so he knew.
He knew everything. He knew about the envelopes of cash, the golf course handshakes, and the building inspectors who conveniently looked the other way when the concrete was poured way too thin.
Yeah.
He knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't an act of God. It was an act of raw greed, completely enabled and protected by the coercive power of the state.
But the state's corruption is only half the equation here, right?
Right.
Because the thing that pushes Daniel into a full-blown psychological crisis is the complicity of his own faith community.
Yeah, this is the breaking point.
The clergy at his family's church, the church they heavily funded, were standing at the pulpit on Sunday morning, literally praising those exact same corrupt city officials.
Unbelievable.
They were blessing the mayor and the city council for their leadership during a difficult time, while families were literally living in the rubble of a rigged, fraudulent contract.
That is the exact moment the spiritual floor falls out from under him. He felt personally, spiritually responsible. He saw exactly how institutional power operates.
Yeah.
When the state and the church align, they can completely insulate themselves from the moral consequences of their actions. The state uses its legal monopoly to shield the wealthy from accountability, and the church uses its spiritual authority to rubber stamp the state.
Wow.
To Daniel, the entire system wasn't just flawed. It was a mechanism explicitly designed to extract wealth and evade moral judgment.
So that is Daniel's foundation. The deep, agonizing scars of wealth, crony capitalism, and institutional complicity. Now you cross the aisle of that church in Hialeah, and you meet Gabriel Martinez. Gabo. Yeah.
Gabo's trauma comes from the exact opposite end of the spectrum.
Totally.
Gabo grew up in Matanzas, which is a city on the northern coast of Cuba. If Daniel's trauma is the trauma of complicity at the top, Gabo's trauma is the trauma of absolute crushing oppression at the very bottom. As a young man, he worked near the glittering Veradero resort strips. And every single day, he was forced to observe this horrific dichotomy. He watched the high-ranking Communist Party elites and foreign tourists drinking imported champagne, dining on lobster, and living in absolute luxury.
While his own people were starving.
Exactly. Meanwhile, ordinary Cubans, his friends, his neighbors, his parents, were subjected to a crumbling infrastructure, waiting in state-mandated bread lines for hours just to secure basic calories to survive.
And the source notes that it wasn't just economic deprivation either. The Cuban state operates on a system of intense neighborhood surveillance. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution.
Right, the CDRs.
Yeah, where your neighbors are actively incentivized to report you to the secret police if you express any dissent.
Exactly. The state demanded total psychological submission in exchange for meager rations. And tragically, Gabo lost both of his parents to the regime.
Oh, that's right.
They were denied medical care while waiting in a bureaucrat of purgatory for exit visas to join him after he had managed to flee to Florida. The source actually quotes Gabo telling the congregation years later, "I've got nothing left in that country, not even memories."
It is staggering to think about these two men sitting in the same room. I really want to zero in on how perfectly these two disparate backgrounds lock together to create a singular, impenetrable worldview.
It's like puzzle pieces.
Yeah. You have Daniel, who has been permanently scarred by a system that extracts wealth through cronyism, using the state to hide behind bureaucratic immunity. And then you have Gabo, permanently scarred by a totalitarian socialist system that extracts basic human dignity and agency under the guise of the collective good.
They approach the exact same conclusion from opposite ends of the universe. They both realize that regardless of whether a government calls itself capitalist or socialist, whenever power is centralized, human dignity is always the first casualty. Power, by its very nature, relies on coercion.
There is this incredibly vivid anecdote in the source document that really captures the genesis of their theology. After the Sunday service in Hialeah, Daniel and Gabo would walk down the street to a local ventanita, one of those open-air walk-up windows attached to a bakery.
Oh yeah, serving those tiny plastic cups of incredibly strong, hyper-sweet Cuban coffee.
Yes, exactly. And they would stand there in the Florida humidity. Daniel, wearing a tailored shirt, stirring his sugar for way too long, just wrestling with his guilt. And Gabo, listening intently, possessing this hardened clarity. They would debate for hours.
I can picture it perfectly.
Right. And one afternoon, Gabo takes a flimsy, yellowed paper napkin from the dispenser. He pulls out a pen and draws two overlapping circles, like a Venn diagram. He labels the left circle faith. He labels the right circle freedom. And right there in the middle, in the overlapping space, he writes a single phrase in Spanish. Dios nos hizo libres. God made us free.
That yellowed napkin is essentially the Rosetta Stone for the entire San Aurelio experiment. Everything that follows the theology, the economics, the settlement, and the fire radiates outward from that one sentence.
But, let me challenge the premise of their meeting for a second.
Sure.
Looking at this historically, could a theology this extreme, this specific, only have been born from these two exact extremes colliding? If you just had two guys who read some political theory online or who were just annoyed about paying income tax, you don't get San Aurelio, do you?
No, definitely not.
Does it fundamentally require someone who has seen the rot of the state from the absolute insulated top and someone who has been crushed by it at the desperate bottom to build something this radical?
It is a profound question, and I believe the answer is definitively yes. Most people only ever see the flaws of the specific system they are actively opposing.
Right.
If you grow up poor under crony capitalism, you might idealize socialism. If you grow up oppressed under socialism, you might idealize corporate capitalism. But Daniel and Gabo stripped away the illusions of both systems.
Wow, yeah.
Daniel knew intimately that corporate capitalism could be deeply corrupted by state power. Gabo knew intimately that state socialism was inherently corrupt state power. They didn't have any romantic notions left about human authority.
So they were totally disillusioned.
Completely. Their combined trauma was the fertile soil. But the actual seed, the highly technical intellectual framework that allowed them to build a cohesive theology out of that shared trauma, came from a very specific school of economic thought.
And this is where the story shifts from a psychological study to a really fascinating intellectual puzzle. After the Tampa housing project collapse, Daniel didn't just walk away from his faith, he went desperately searching.
He needed answers.
Yeah, he started reading voraciously, trying to find a moral framework that could explain the corruption he had witnessed, answers his pastors couldn't or wouldn't provide. And in that search, he discovers the writings and lectures of a Spanish economist named Jesus Huerta de Soto.
This discovery is the spark that ignites the ideological fusion. Jesus Huerta de Soto is a very prominent, highly regarded contemporary figure in the Austrian School of Economics.
Okay, Austrian economics.
Right. Now, for those who might not spend their weekends reading economic theory, the Austrian school is a framework of economic thought that radically departs from the mainstream macroeconomic models you might learn in a standard college course.
That's pretty niche, right?
It is. It emphasizes the spontaneous organizing power of the price mechanism, the subjective nature of value, And it harbors a deep, fundamental skepticism of any form of central planning or government intervention.
Okay, let's slow down and translate some of this. Because throwing around terms like subjective nature of value and price mechanism can sound like we're just reading a textbook. Let's ground this.
Sure, let's break it down.
Explain the subjective nature of value to me like I'm a 5-year-old running a lemonade stand. How does Austrian economics view value differently than, say, a central planner?
It's a crucial distinction. Let's look at it practically. A classical Marxist, or a central planner, often relies on something called the labor theory of value.
Okay, the labor theory.
Yes, this theory suggests that the value of a good, say, a wooden chair, is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time it took to produce it. If it took 10 hours of labor to cut the wood and build the chair, its value is objectively tied to those 10 hours. Therefore, a central planner believes they can calculate prices mathematically from the top down.
Ah, I see. So it's like saying, I worked 10 hours on this, so it is worth $50, regardless of who is actually buying it.
Exactly. But the Austrian school, and specifically thinkers like Huerta de Soto,
Yep.
argue that value is entirely subjective.
Subjective, meaning it changes.
Yes, value does not exist inside the wooden chair itself. Value exists entirely within the mind of the individual looking at the chair in a specific moment in time.
Oh, that makes sense.
Think about it like this. A bottle of water has very little value to you if you're standing next to a fresh mountain spring. You wouldn't pay much for it.
Right, I just drink from the spring.
But if you are wandering in the Sahara Desert, that exact same bottle of water, which took the exact same amount of labor to produce at the factory, is suddenly worth your entire life savings. Value is an internal, subjective ranking of human desires.
Oh, wow. Which means no central planner, no government agency, no committee, no algorithm can possibly calculate what things are worth because they cannot look inside the minds of millions of individuals to see their subjective desires changing second by second.
Exactly. This brings us to what the Austrian economist F.A. Hayek famously called the fatal conceit of central planners.
The fatal conceit.
The conceit is the arrogant belief that a small group of bureaucrats can possess enough decentralized knowledge to efficiently run an economy. In reality, the only way that decentralized knowledge can be communicated is organically from the bottom up through the price mechanism. When you willingly pay $5 for a cup of coffee, you are sending a microsignal to the global market about your subjective desires.
Right. So take that economic fatal conceit and apply it to Daniel's theological crisis. He reads Huerta de Soto, who is unique because he explicitly, rigorously links these principles of classical liberalism, private property, and the free market directly to Christian ethics.
Yes, that's the key.
Huerta de Soto argues that things like banking regulations or central banking inflation aren't just inefficient economic policies, they are a literal violation of the biblical commandment, thou shalt not steal.
And Daniel reads this, and it is an absolute revelation for him. He begins translating this highly technical economic theory into theological doctrine.
Right.
If the fatal conceit is that men try to play God by centrally planning an economy, Daniel realizes that God himself is the ultimate decentralizer.
This is such a wild, brilliant analogy when you map it out. Think about the concept of divine free will. God creates humanity, but he doesn't hardwire us to be automatically good.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't program us like robots to flawlessly execute moral behavior. He gives us agency. He decentralizes the moral decision-making down to the level of the individual human soul. Why? Because forced goodness isn't goodness at all.
That's a profound way to look at it.
Right. A robot fetching you a glass of water doesn't love you. It's just executing code.
That is precisely the theological bridge Daniel and Gabo built.
Yeah.
If God designed the universe to operate on decentralized moral agency free will, then a central planner trying to force economic or moral outcomes from the top down is essentially committing an act of profound blasphemy.
Blasphemy.
Yes, they are trying to override the architecture of God's creation. A government trying to enforce equality by seizing property and redistributing it is committing the exact same sin as someone trying to force moral outcomes by stripping away free will.
So economic freedom and spiritual freedom weren't two parallel concepts in this theology. They were the exact same mechanism operating in different spheres of reality. The ability to choose your trade, set your own price, and keep the fruits of your labor was completely indistinguishable from the ability to choose salvation.
And this leads Daniel to start preaching a deeply radical message to that small congregation in Hialeah. The source document quotes one of his early teachings. He stood before them and said, God made us free, not so we could exploit our brothers, but so we could serve them without chains.
Serve them without chains. That's powerful.
He went on to say, when the state takes that freedom, when it dictates your labor and your property, it steals from God himself. Property rights are not a secular legal construct written down by men in powdered wigs. They are divine mandates.
But abstract theology debated over Cuban coffee is one thing. What happens when this philosophy has to actually walk around in the dirt?
Right, the practical application.
Yeah, if freedom is a divine mandate and central planning is blasphemy, how did Daniel and Gabo view the actual mundane day-to-day acts of buying and selling?
To understand how this theory operated in practice, we really have to look at a specific interaction detailed in the source document between Gabo and a woman named Sarah.
Okay, who is Sarah?
Sarah was a local farmer who brought produce to a small, unregulated farmer's market. And she had recently had several of her commercial greenhouses bulldozed by state agricultural inspectors.
Bulldozed? Wait, why?
Because she had refused to pay the necessary expediting fees, essentially municipal bribes, to get her permits approved. She was yet another victim of state coercion.
Unbelievable.
So Gabo approaches her at her produce stand. He looks at her goods and asks her very simply how she determines the prices for her vegetables. Sarah kind of laughs, assuming he's haggling, and says, I set them as low as I can without losing my shirt.
Makes sense.
But Gabo presses her. He asks, no, who tells you what you are allowed to charge? And Sarah looks at him completely confused and says, nobody. It's my stand, my labor, my goods.
And Gabo smiles and says, that's freedom. That's exactly how it should be.
Yes. Gabo takes this interaction back to the congregation, and he uses it to expand their theology. He preaches that the market itself, when free from coercion, is inherently moral.
The market as a moral entity.
Exactly. The source text has this direct, powerful quote from Gabo. He said, the market teaches ethics far better than any sermon delivered from a pulpit. You cannot cheat people for long. They will see through your lies and stop trading with you.
Which is true.
You cannot steal or you will lose your reputation and their trust. Voluntary trade is God's design because it explicitly respects the dignity he gave each of us.
The market as a moral teacher. But let me push back on this because it sounds idyllic, but reality is incredibly messy.
Oh, for sure.
What happens to the vulnerable? In a system where every transaction must be voluntary and the state cannot force redistribution, what happens to the disabled? What happens to the elderly who have no goods to trade and no labor to offer?
That's the big question.
Right. If charity is entirely voluntary, doesn't the free market just let them starve if people aren't feeling particularly generous that day? How did Daniel and Gabo defend the theology against the helpless?
It is the most common and vital critique of their philosophy. Daniel and Gabo's defense rested on two pillars: the mechanics of reputational capital and the theological imperative of chosen charity.
Okay, break that down.
In their view, if you rely on the state to violently tax citizens to provide a social safety net, you destroy the social fabric of the community. You essentially outsource your empathy to a bureaucracy.
I see.
In a truly voluntary community, taking care of the vulnerable becomes the active, daily responsibility of the individual.
So it's not that they didn't believe in welfare. They believed welfare had to be decentralized.
Exactly. They relied on mutual aid.
Yeah.
If a farmer broke his leg and couldn't harvest his crops, the community would harvest them for him. Not because a state agency mandated it, but because of reputational capital and genuine love.
And if you didn't help?
If you were a selfish person who never helped anyone, you would suffer social ostracization. Your reputational capital would plummet. But more importantly, from the theological perspective, a moral act is only truly moral if it is chosen freely.
Right, because if you have a gun to your head, you aren't making a moral choice. You're just trying to survive.
Think about it in the context of modern taxation. In our society, the state taxes you under the explicit threat of force. If you don't pay, they will seize your assets. If you resist the seizure, men with guns will put you in a cage.
Very true.
The state takes that coerced money and uses some of it to help the poor. Many people view that as a collective moral good. But in Daniel and Gabo's theology, the state has just violently removed your moral agency.
Because if the state forces you to pay for charity, you aren't actually being charitable. You are being extorted. You don't get the spiritual credit, so to speak, because you didn't have the option to say no.
Precisely. Personal responsibility, charity, helping your neighbor, and ultimately salvation itself. These actions must be entirely voluntary or they are spiritually void. Forced charity is an oxymoron to them.
This reverence for the voluntary plays out so beautifully in the source material when we look at how they structured human relationships inside the actual settlement of San Aurelio.
It really does.
There is this incredible, almost cinematic scene detailing the first wedding held in the community. It wasn't held in a church. There was no state official present to sign a government marriage license because they explicitly refused to ask the state for permission to marry.
They viewed a state marriage license as a three-party contract where the government becomes the dominant partner in a holy union.
Exactly. So they held the wedding in a clearing in the Everglades. The bride's dress was painstakingly sewn together from scraps of linen that had been voluntarily donated by different families in the community. Yeah, they had a roast pig, jars of homemade mead. It was a celebration operating entirely on mutual trust. Daniel officiated the ceremony, and he didn't talk about legal obligations at all. He spoke entirely about a voluntary covenant between two sovereign individuals before God.
And the most striking detail is Gabo stepping up during the ceremony to add a single line to the traditional vows. He told the couple, "Love, like freedom, is never imposed. It can only be offered and received."
Love, like freedom, is never imposed. That encapsulates their entire worldview perfectly.
It really is the core of it.
Force invalidates love. Coercion invalidates morality. But, if we stretch this logic to its absolute limit, does this mean that every single economic transaction in San Aurelio was viewed with the same reverence as that wedding?
What do you mean?
Like if a guy trades a quart of raw, unpasteurized goat's milk for an ounce of silver, or someone fixes a broken alternator on a truck in exchange for a jar of honey, were those mundane acts essentially viewed as religious sacraments?
In a very literal sense, yes. Because each of those transactions was a physical manifestation of their theology. When you trade voluntarily, you are recognizing the other person's sovereign ownership of their labor and their physical body.
Right.
You are treating them as a free being created in the imago Dei, the image of God. You are not treating them as a tool to be exploited or a subject to be ruled. A voluntary trade of honey for an alternator is two humans respecting the divine agency of the other.
Which means the inverse must also be true. If voluntary exchange is fundamentally holy, then coercive exchange is fundamentally evil.
And this realization is what leads us directly to the absolute crux of their theology. It is the most radical and ultimately the most dangerous part of their belief system, their view of the state.
Because if you look at most fringe Christian enclaves or radical libertarian groups, the root of all evil is usually identified as secularism or Hollywood or the Federal Reserve or fiat paper money.
Right, the usual suspects.
But Daniel and Gabo did not view money as the root of evil. In fact, they viewed honest money, specifically silver and gold, which couldn't be manipulated by a central bank, as God's reward for serving the needs of your fellow man. To them, the true, pure, unadulterated evil in the universe was coercion.
To understand how they categorized the state, we really have to look at how they viewed the concept of Satan.
Okay, let's get into this.
In their theological writings, they consistently referred to him as Ha-Satan. This is the original Hebrew term found in the Old Testament, which translates closer to the adversary or the accuser rather than, a guy in a red suit with a pitchfork.
Right.
But they didn't view Ha-Satan merely as some localized spiritual entity whispering in your ear, trying to get you to commit petty individual sins like lying or cheating on your spouse.
Right. Daniel wrote, "The state is not God. The state is the tempter. The state is the lie that men choose to believe."
In their framework, Ha-Satan is the tempter of states. He is the patron saint of tyranny. The best way to understand this is to use a modern technological analogy. Think of Satan not as an evil overlord, but as God's ultimate quality assurance, or QA tester.
Okay, this is where the theology gets absolutely terrifying. Explain the QA analogy to me. How does a software testing concept map onto the devil?
Well, in software development, a QA tester's job is not to build the code. Their job is to stress test the system, to actively try to break it, to find the vulnerabilities and see where the code fails under pressure.
Okay, I follow that.
Now apply that to theology. In Daniel and Gabo's view, God created humanity with free will. Free will is the ultimate open source software. It is beautiful, but it is highly unstable.
Because people make bad choices.
Exactly. So Satan's job, assigned by God, is to act as the ultimate QA tester. His purpose is to tempt humanity, to stress test our free will, and see if we will willingly abandon it.
And what is the mechanism of that temptation?
The ultimate temptation isn't drugs or lust or greed. The ultimate temptation is the illusion of power, security, and control. The ultimate temptation is the state.
So the state is the shortcut.
Precisely. Building a community based entirely on voluntary exchange, mutual trust, and actual physical charity is incredibly hard.
It's exhausting.
It is messy, people disagree, crops fail, people get sick. It requires constant, exhausting, active moral effort from every single individual.
Right.
The temptation Satan's pitch to humanity is to say, look how exhausting freedom is. Why do all that hard work? Just give me a monopoly on violence. Let me form a central state. We will force everyone to be good.
We'll do the work for you.
Exactly. We will violently tax the rich to feed the poor. We will heavily regulate the farmers so no one gets hurt. Just surrender your divine agency to me. Give up your free will, and I will mathematically engineer a utopia for you.
Wow. So Satan's role is literally to separate the grain from the straw, to see who will rely on faith and the difficult work of voluntary community, and who will give in to the coercive power of the state simply because it's an easier, lazier path to security.
If we connect this to the bigger historical picture, it completely reframes how we view political history. Think about Gabo looking back at the destruction of Cuba.
Yeah.
In his eyes, the totalitarian socialism that destroyed his country and killed his parents wasn't just a flawed macroeconomic policy. It wasn't just a corrupt political regime. It was a profound spiritual failure.
A spiritual failure?
Yes, it was the Cuban citizenry failing the ultimate theological QA test by surrendering their divine agency to the tempter, hoping for security and equality, and receiving absolute tyranny instead.
That is a staggering, overwhelming way to view human history. But, for you listening, if you follow this logic to its inevitable conclusion, it raises a massive, terrifying red flag.
Oh, absolutely.
If the state is literally the physical incarnation of Satan's temptation, how can you possibly interact with it?
Yeah, you can't.
Right. You can't just compromise. You can't just pay a parking ticket or file an income tax return or use the postal service and say, well, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, because in this theology, Caesar is the devil.
Exactly.
Rendering unto Caesar is explicitly failing the QA test. If you pay your taxes, you are funding the machinery of coercion. Doesn't this worldview inherently make any form of coexistence with the modern outside world completely mathematically impossible?
It makes it entirely impossible. You have spotted the exact friction point that doomed them. That impossibility of compromise is exactly what drove Daniel, Gabo, and their followers out of the suburbs of Miami and into the hostile, mosquito-choked swamps of the Everglades.
They had to leave.
They realized they couldn't just preach this on Sundays while paying taxes on Mondays. It led to the practical, physical application of their beliefs, the founding of San Aurelio, and it is the exact mechanism of their ultimate downfall.
So let's transition from the realm of philosophy into the physical dirt and humidity of Florida. Let's talk about San Aurelio in practice. They pool their resources, and they find this abandoned ghost town, an old, rotting sugar mill settlement deep out in the middle of nowhere.
The perfect isolated spot.
Yeah, and they don't just sit around reading Austrian economics and praying for the apocalypse. They actually build the society they theorized.
And they built it from absolute scratch. The source document features diary entries describing the physical toll. You have sunburned people, formerly accountants and teachers, working in stiff canvas shirts until dark.
Grueling work.
They were salvaging rusted nails from old timber, clearing land choked with dense palmettos and snakes. But more importantly than the physical buildings, they successfully built the decentralized economy they had theorized.
Let's talk about the raw mechanics of how they lived, because this is where the theory hits reality. How did they handle currency?
They completely abandoned the U.S. dollar. They viewed fiat currency as a fraudulent instrument of state inflation, essentially a hidden tax. Instead, they traded in physical silver coins and relied heavily on direct barter.
Which, ironically, outsider observers and local rumor mills later sensationalized into whispers of a massive hidden gold vault buried under the sugar mill.
Right, the mythology of it all.
But day to day, it was incredibly mundane. A beekeeper's harvest of honey became a form of currency. Goat milk was turned into cheese and traded for labor. If your roof was leaking, someone in the community would come fix it for free, building reputational capital.
Yes.
They gave away excess food to struggling outsiders who lived on the edge of the swamps, and they explicitly refused to require any paperwork, ID, or proof of need. They were literally living out their theology of personal responsibility and voluntary charity.
How did they handle property taxes on the land they bought, though? That's the real trap.
The source notes they utilized a complex, anonymous shell trust to hold the title to the land, trying to legally insulate the community from municipal tax assessors. They viewed it as a defensive shield against extortion.
But here is the profound tragedy of San Aurelio. There was an insurmountable, catastrophic disconnect between their internal reality and the external perception of the outside world.
Yeah, the two completely clash.
Internally, the community was defined by a deep, albeit fragile, voluntary cooperation. There's a quote in the source from a woman named Rachel who recorded life inside the town. She wrote that internally, security was a man with a rifle who might not need to fire it, and peace was fragile, always one bad night away from breaking.
So it wasn't perfect.
It wasn't a magical, flawless utopia. They were human, they argued. Tempers flared over missing tools or ruined crops. But it was theirs. Every interaction was voluntary.
But externally, man, externally the narrative just mutated into a terrifying monster.
It did. The media and the government cannot comprehend a society operating outside of coercive control. They look at a peaceful community trading in silver and saw a sinister shadow economy.
Of course they did.
They saw people carrying hunting rifles to protect their livestock from wild hogs and labeled them armed separatists running tactical training camps. They looked at people who simply wanted to be left alone to practice their faith and saw a dangerous, subversive cult of tax evaders.
The source document features these chilling, contrasting quotes that show exactly how the narrative split between the people who actually knew them and the institutions that feared them.
Oh, the DJ quote, right?
Yes. You have a local radio DJ, a guy who actually interacted with the San Aurelians at a regional farmers market, saying on air, they're just polite, hardworking people. They pay in silver, they mind their business.
And then the IRS.
Right, contrasting that. On national television, you have an IRS spokesperson standing in front of a wall of microphones, wearing a suit, firmly stating tax evasion is a federal crime. You have leaked Washington memos warning of economic contagion and the threat of parallel economic structures.
Economic contagion. Think deeply of that specific phrase for a second. The federal government wasn't terrified because San Aurelio was violent. There is no record of them ever initiating violence against anyone.
Not once.
The government was terrified because San Aurelio was peaceful and it was working.
This is a crucial point that needs to be underlined. Why did the state have to act? It wasn't really about the few $1,000s in unpaid property taxes, was it? I mean, the IRS writes off millions in corporate tax debt every day. It wasn't about the rumors of a gold vault.
No. The state had to act because San Aurelio's very existence challenged the state's monopoly on morality and community. If a group of ordinary people can pull back from society, build a functioning community, take care of their own poor, adjudicate their own disputes without a state judge, and engage in complex commerce entirely without state coercion, it exposes a terrifying truth to the bureaucracy. The state is fundamentally unnecessary.
Oh.
To the power structures in Washington, San Aurelio wasn't just a quirky commune. It was a dangerous precedent. It was a virus that could spread. They were labeled extremists.
And to the San Aurelians, looking out past the tree line, the state was the tempter. It was Ha-Satan, bringing armored vehicles, IRS audits, and heavily armed tactical teams to crush their divine freedom. They viewed the impending raid not as a legal dispute, but as a spiritual siege.
It was an inevitable collision. You had two completely incompatible operating systems trying to run on the exact same piece of hardware.
Good analogy.
The state operates on the premise that it has ultimate jurisdiction over all property and persons within its borders. San Aurelio operated on the premise that God had granted them sovereign jurisdiction over their own lives and that the state's borders were an illusion maintained by violence.
Which leads to the deeply tragic, fiery end of this deep dive. The federal agencies converge. The ATF, the IRS, the Department of Homeland Security. They establish a perimeter. They surround the old sugar mill.
It's just a massive show of force.
The legal justifications used by the government were a web of alleged tax evasion, zoning violations, and the suspicion of unregistered firearms. But the standoff wasn't about the law. It was about submission. The state demanded that Daniel and Gabo submit to their authority, step out with their hands up, and acknowledge the supremacy of the federal government.
And according to their theology, to submit to the state was to submit to the tempter. To surrender their autonomy was to fail the ultimate QA test. They refused to come out.
The standoff ends in fire and smoke. The mechanics of the raid are brutal. Tear gas is deployed. The salvaged post office building catches fire and burns to the ground. In the chaos, Gabo is killed. Daniel is killed.
Just devastating.
The survivors, the people who had sewn the wedding dress, the people who had traded honey for alternator repairs, are dragged out of the swamps and into federal courtrooms in Miami.
And as the source material explicitly notes, the ensuing trials weren't really about determining who shot first or parsing the nuances of tax law. The trials were designed to make San Aurelio a public example. The message broadcasted to the rest of the country was crystal clear: resist the blueprint, attempt to step outside the system, and the system will absolutely crush you.
But if we look at the ashes of that settlement through the specific lens of Daniel and Gabo's theology, the narrative shifts entirely. To them, it wasn't just a political raid. It wasn't a law enforcement operation gone horribly wrong. It was the final, inevitable, apocalyptic clash between voluntary faith and coercive power.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. We have explored a profoundly complex intellectual web. We watched how Daniel, a disillusioned construction heir fleeing crony capitalism, and Gabo, a scarred refugee fleeing totalitarian socialism, met in a Hialeah church and engineered something entirely new.
Yeah.
They fused the highly technical, decentralized free market principles of Austrian economics with devout Christian theology.
They built a worldview where true salvation, genuine charity, and actual morality can only exist through free will and voluntary exchange.
And in doing so, they positioned the state not as a necessary evil or a flawed protector, but as the ultimate temptation, the QA tester designed by God to see if humanity would willingly trade its divine, chaotic agency for the false, coercive illusion of security.
This entire story raises an incredibly uncomfortable, important question for all of us. As you are listening to this, whether you are driving to work, sitting at a desk, or doing the dishes, how much of your daily interaction with the world around you is truly fundamentally voluntary?
That is the question.
How much do we rely on external forces, the state, institutions, regulations, and bureaucracies, to guarantee our physical safety and manage our moral responsibilities? And what exactly are we trading away in return for that subsidized comfort?
If Daniel and Gabo were right, we are trading away the very thing San Aurelio was built to protect: the heavy, beautiful, divine burden of choosing to be good, rather than simply being forced to comply.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something that wasn't explicitly debated by the media anchors or the federal judges, but that echoes loudly out of the final pages of the source material. Think about the physical ending of San Aurelio.
Yeah.
The town burned to the ground, its founders were killed, its people were scattered, imprisoned, and traumatized. By every single metric of the outside world, by every measurement of success we use, the state won. San Aurelio was utterly crushed.
That's the external view.
But if Daniel and Gabo's theology was actually right, if Satan's role in the universe is simply as the ultimate QA tester, designed to separate the grain from the straw and stress test our free will, then did San Aurelio actually fail? Or, by refusing to compromise their voluntary covenant, by refusing to surrender their divine agency to the state, even in the face of absolute fiery destruction, did they pass the test?
That is the ghost that still haunts the ashes of the Everglades.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, we leave you to mull over the ashes, the echoes, and the unbroken cipher of San Aurelio.